another live hangout from the Equal Life Foundation. And today we have decided to come to the table and discuss a topic that has been transpiring on our mainstream media, which is related to mass shootings, domestic terrorism, and what has specifically happened yesterday also in California, in San Bernardino. And we decided that it is time that we come here and give some perspectives that are not usually shared in the mainstream media, to give a more holistic perspective, to look at what is behind these kind of live drills and these kind of shootings that we are presented with that drive people into fear, anxiety, and press conferences by the president and so forth. Is there anything of another agenda behind it? What is it also within our society that has caused these kind of events to become a normal thing, to the point that we have made it part of our day-to-day news reel? So it is time that we open up some threads to this discussion. It is a vast topic for sure, but I'm certain that you will find it refreshing to hear what we have to share with you, with my co-hosts, guests, Joana Jesus from Portugal. So Joana, welcome to the Hangout.
Hi Marlen, hi everyone, thank you.
And Joku from California, actually quite close to San Bernardino, isn't it?
Yes, quite close. And hello everybody.
Awesome. So to anyone that is watching, please consider there's going to be questions, comments that you can place throughout the live transmission. And this means that if you're watching on the YouTube video repetition, please place your comment and we will make sure we get to it. So let's start with this discussion, and let's have a brief look for anyone that is not up to date with what has transpired. Joe, can you share with us what has happened lately, specifically in America, in Colorado, and specifically also San Bernardino, that has prompted us to come and share here on this topic?
Yes, so recently in the United States, there have been what's called mass shootings. Now, mass shootings isn't something new. It's happened throughout history in the United States. But what's interesting now is there seems to be a ramping up of attention regarding mass shootings. It began with the mass shooting that occurred quite recently in Colorado Springs. This happened at a Planned Parenthood center. Planned Parenthood, for those who are not familiar with it, it's an organization that provides abortions, basically, and counseling and support for people that are considering having abortions, and they provide condoms and contraceptives and things like that. Now, ever since that shooting occurred, we began to see in the media a lot of debate and a lot of attention drawn to the issue of gun control, and also, of course, the issue of abortion, and characterizing the attacker, the perpetrator, as being symbolic of the mindset of people who are against Planned Parenthood, which is obviously not true. It's clearly a propaganda piece that's going on. But what's interesting is you never in the media talk about, or you never hear from the media, the deeper story behind the incidents of mass shooting. For example, what was the actual profile of the person? What was their history? What was their medical history? What kind of drugs had they been on? What was their psychological profile? What was their social economic status? What has all been a factor in contributing to that event happening? Now, going a bit further, just recently, just actually yesterday, in San Bernardino, California, was the most recent mass shooting event. This actually resulted in, I believe the last count was 14 confirmed deaths and wounded, with, I believe, one suspect in custody and 2 shot dead after a shootout. Now, this event, again, you see getting a lot of media attention, which I suppose it should, but then you have to question, why was this event kind of singled out and given more attention than the massive amounts of shootings that occur in this country on a day-to-day, month-to-month basis? Why are some events seemingly made out to be a special or rare occurrences that deserve special national attention? And I think this is some of the stuff that we'll get into today. So for those of you who are not familiar with these incidents, you can do a quick search on the internet for Colorado Springs and the San Bernardino shootings. You'll find many news sources covering the mainstream stuff.
And this has also become like a normal point for shootings. We've heard many times of school shootings ever since Columbine in the 1999, and ever since then it has become like a normal thing that we get the president coming out, and there comes the media frenzy that, from my perspective, it's also like a way to up the ratings, because we are drawn as human beings to fear and to this kind of sensationalism. So, Joanna, I'd like to hear your perspective also as a media insider, how these events are usually portrayed, what we get to hear, what is usually not being told, and for what reasons, and give us shed some light on this subject, please.
I think Joanna may be having some technical issues.
Okay, so she might be freezing. Well, from my perspective on the subject of mainstream media and the show that it has become, we have to start questioning what we presented and for what reason. One thing that came up within me yesterday is that there was also a great deal of news when Russia presented actual proof that Turkey is getting oil from ISIS. And the US decided that they won't buy into the proof that Russia has presented. And then hours later, you get this shooting. So, it's like a way to divert people's attention from this realization of what is going on with the whole fight against terror and ISIS, to getting back to the notion of domestic terror and getting people into that mindset again of, oh, now there's terrorism at home. Is it planted? Is it meaning planted, manufactured by the government or by any other faction for particular purposes, of course? Or is it really people that suddenly have mental issues and that decide to commit this kind of attacks? Or is it really just a way to cover up and certain agendas that will be later on disclosed? So Joanna, can you hear us now? I think she can't hear us.
Okay, we'll reserve that question for Joanna when she comes back. Just to touch on this subject, it's one of the things that I think is really important to understand is when we're looking at news stories, especially when it comes to stories that get massive attention, 24-hour coverage or extended coverage, you have to also look at what are they not reporting? What is this story filling up time for? And when you ask that question, you realize that there's a lot more going on that is actually quite newsworthy, like what you just mentioned about the recent developments with Russia and Turkey and the ISIS situation. We're not getting that coverage because instead we're getting coverage about this mass shooting incident. There is a tendency to see, oh, well, this is why they did it. They did this to cover up that news story. Well, not necessarily, because we have to understand that the news media is a very well-organized system. Okay, it doesn't necessarily have to be this particular shooting. It could be any kind of story. If it is necessary to not report on something, it is not hard to find a different story to wrap people's attention around. So that's something that we need to bring into awareness here, I think. But I'll throw that back to you, Marlen and Joanna.
Well, let's see if Joanna can hear us now. It seems that she's not here, but we can go on to what is commonly mentioned, Joe, and you brought it up that in the introduction on the Second Amendment, anti-gun activists, pro-gun, the gun culture in America. There is this notion that, well, we're seeing too many mass shootings, there must be gun control. But are guns really the problem in this subject? What's your perspective?
Yeah, this is interesting because oftentimes what you hear first when you look at stories about mass shootings and these kinds of events is the issue of gun control. Is gun control the solution to stopping these kinds of mass shooting events, or is the solution to provide people more access to guns? One of the favorite arguments from associations like the NRA or the pro-gun lobbyists, the extremes I'm talking about, one of their favorite arguments is that an armed society is a safer society, and they'll draw up statistics about how societies that have more private ownership of guns have a lower ratio of gun violence. But on the other extreme, we have people that say that the solution actually is to remove all access to all guns, that guns are not acceptable in any way in our society because it is the tool that makes the act of violence that much easier and more deadlier. So if we remove that, that should be the solution. The problem with this kind of dynamic and this kind of argument is that you're only going to be on polarized ends. You're never going to see the deeper subtext. For example, if you take the argument of the NRA that says, well, this is your Second Amendment. You have the right to own and bear arms. It's in our Constitution. It's American, right? This is what the founders wanted. But if you really look at history and you look at what was going on when the Constitution was being written, according to that actual history, that circumstance, the founders of the country were fighting a revolution, okay, and they were concerned about the rise of a tyrannical government. They understood that you needed an army to defend yourself, but they also understood that if that army became too closely tied to the government, then that government may use that army against civilians. Now, that's why civilians were expected to be part of local militia. So if you look at the Constitution, the actual amendment says that the amendment is about providing arms, the right to bear arms for men to serve in the militia, to defend against tyrannical armies. This has nothing to do with your right to own guns for whatever reason and to carry it wherever you want. This is not about individual rights to bear arms. This is about the responsibility to bear arms against tyrannical government as part of an organized militia. So when we hear these arguments about pro-gun, anti-gun, it's really important to get to where the actual founding documents are coming from and what they're actually saying about why there should be guns and what is their proper place within a society.
And it also leads us to question, why should we have this kind of Bill of Rights, especially in America, that are leading toward this potential antagonism or battle against your own government, which is also very questionable from my outsider perspective. And I fully agree with what you've shared, that I didn't have that specificity on the understanding of the Second Amendment, for example. But then again, we have to ponder, well, why are these people killing others if these people are in fact having some kind of mental health problem or have been socially discriminated or racially profiled and things like that, that lead to a human being to decide to go and produce this kind of massive killings or just attacking others for the sake of getting some kind of message through? Is this the way that things should exist in this world? Why are we seeing this kind of events with more, in a more often manner nowadays? What have we also as a society dismissed or not been looking at, not paying attention, that has enabled more and more people to start doing this? Joanna, can you hear us?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Okay, so we can go to the question that I had with you now that we have you here. I wanted you to share your perspective on the media, being a media insider as well, how these kind of events are portrayed in the media, and if there is something that we don't usually get to hear in terms of this kind of news, the effect that these news have on people. What's your take on this?
Well, from my perspective, and sometimes we think that the media show us what we want to hear, or it's actually the opposite, where we decide what the media is showing us. But in fact, this is a relationship that hasn't been established, so we don't have actually the power to decide what is actually relevant for us to see in the news unless we decide to change channels or to simply disconnect from mainstream media and try to find information somewhere else. And that is the kind of media education that is not so promoted. And by the way, please let me know if you don't hear me at some point, so I will repeat some of the points. But as I was saying, there's this a tendency to accept what media says because it's on TV. You have a whole production, you have these journalists with a whole bunch of coverage, and we think that's the only kind of information, that's the one side that we are being informed, and we take it for face value instead of actually asking ourselves, okay, but what is the other side? What's the perspective? And having more of a holistic view of what the news are. And if we see something on one square of that image, what about the rest? And that's usually is actually the big picture that we're missing. And then the other part of the way that media is actually working these days is to work a lot with our emotions. So the highs and the lows, and you can see for yourself where when you're watching TV, especially TV, where you have a very positive news and then suddenly a very dramatic news, and it will play with you and it will affect you if you actually allow it, but it's very common that that happens. And so there's this kind of relationship that we have with media and our access to information where it's like what we have accepted, but it doesn't have to be like that. In terms of my actually opinion as to this type of news, actually it's quite common to talk about the media as the 3 S's, which is sex, scandals, and sports. And this is like a formula that works with a lot of people. It resonates with a lot of people. And when we go to scandal, it's actually this type of news, like mass murdered, crashes, plane crashes is also another example, anything that we feel it's outside of our control. And it scares us because we think, well, this can happen anywhere. And it creates this environment of living terrified. But if we actually dig into the numbers, sometimes it's actually the numbers that tells us, oh, in fact, what happens in this place, like 14 people, it's really bad, but let's look at the big picture. What are other areas in our society that we are completely neglecting without having media coverage? Let's look at actual diseases that we do need to find cures, but for some reason they're not having the attention. So that is also part of our attention. Where are we giving attention to certain news than others? What is actually triggering us to respond? Because it's either it's an immediate reality or because it's something that we were educated to. In other areas of news, we're not really bothered. So that's also about our how we what our priorities are. How do we prioritize? And in this case, obviously lives is like it's the priority. But in here, then let's have a look at other areas where our lives are also being neglecting, well, starting by economics, but then that's not a popular theme. So usually people don't know so much about it, and you're not going to hear them speaking about that topic in a coffee shop or something. So it's much easier to get a conversation around crime and things that people will probably watch in movies. So that's another, but maybe we'll discuss that later on, but like how the media industry, the film industry particularly, does impact on our attention span to specific news.
That's such an awesome point. Joe, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think it's very important to understand what gets attention and why. Because when we look at, for example, the mass shootings scenario, the way that it's framed and the amount of attention that it gets, and particularly the response that we see immediately afterwards from authorities and from the president, it's very telling, the relationship between media and agendas within our administration, within our government, within the various alphabet agencies that are in control of the world system. One quick example is when it comes to mass shootings, I mentioned earlier that this is not a new phenomenon by any means. America has a violent streak to it. There are shootings every day, but only certain pieces tend to get picked up and sensationalized and get special coverage. And whenever that happens, you'll see the president come on with the proposed solution, which is what? Gun control. Tighter controls on guns, tighter restrictions on who gets to own what and when and why and how. And I find it interesting also to mention here that during Obama's administration, now not to say Obama's orchestrating anything, but simply saying during the time that Obama has been president, there has been a ramping up of the argument to control guns, to take away guns, to limit guns. And in the space of Obama's administration, violent mass shooting incidents have increased 700%. Before Obama was in office, when we look at the presidency of, let's say, Reagan, there were probably an average of 25 mass shooting events. Now, since Obama has been president, that number has skyrocketed into hundreds. I believe the last figure I saw was about 600 of such mass shooting events. Now, we have not had 600 news stories about these mass shooting events. Only some get cherry-picked. Only some get sensationalized. Why? Because they become talking points. And around talking points, governments can position themselves to give you their solution, their proposed agenda, which is to take guns away and also to install more and more police state, more and more armed response. And I want to touch on this topic again, but I'd like to open this up to you guys as well first to see what your perspective is on that.
Well, first of all, I agree that it is necessary to broaden this up and not take things as face value, and to understand that, yes, the media is directing our attention and our minds to a particular set of topics, so that we don't look at things that are, causing more deaths, like overdoses and heart attacks and alcoholism and car crashes. That kills probably even more people than these kind of events. But then again, we have to consider that, yes, there can be a reason behind this all and why this kind of events get this broadened attention. One of the things that I would definitely like to share is that there is a possibility, or with sufficient proof, that there is the planting of this kind of terrorist attacks. We've seen, if you do some research on YouTube, just by the fact that you're interested in knowing more about this kind of events and getting to know the profiles of the people, you do find these videos on YouTube and in many other sources that explain to you why this could be a planted terrorism and for a specific purpose. Gun control is one. But the militarized state, or the police state, is one that also gets people's attention. Why? Because we know the usual formula, as we've said before, of create the problem, provide a solution, and then we get people to, consenting to, let's say, giving away their guns, which is just one aspect. But I would also like to bring the discussion to, well, why are we even requiring to resort to having to own guns to feel protected? How have we failed as a society to not only create the kind of mental illness and social disruption that some of the individuals and their profiles as mass shooters have showed us to be, that they're being not paid attention sufficiently from the moment that they're with their parents and in schools and so forth, and they become just like these things that we pick up as some news item, instead of saying, hey, this is really more speaking of a social illness, social disease that we're not paying attention to. And this is where I would also like to focus further on in our conversation, but definitely to question what we are being presented as this kind of solution. And comes up the Superman, the president. How can we trust the government that is proposing a gun solution instead of proposing, let's say, a living income to provide a guaranteed well-being for every person, precisely, maybe, possibly, to actually prevent this kind of events, this kind of hatred, this kind of separation? So what's your take, guys?
Okay, so I'll jump in on that. So in terms of something like a living income as a solution, that is, in my perspective, the golden key. Because it's not just that it's an economic solution. The meat of it is what it allows people to do that they currently cannot do, which is to live unconditionally. And this is very important to understand, because when we're living in a society, in a world where we're not constantly under threat of having to perform, having to hold a certain kind of job, always under pressure to compete with ourselves and with each other for no reason other than to earn enough money to buy our existence. When we free ourselves of that, we realize that we don't need to compete, and in fact, it's much easier and much more beneficial to be cooperative, to support each other, to create societies that are sustaining rather than parasitical. What we have to understand is our current relationship to survival is competitive and adversarial instead of nurturing and natural. So when we're talking about solutions such as an equal money or a living income, it's not that it's the economics of it, it's what it allows us to do that we're currently not able to do, which is, like I said, live unconditionally. And when we do that, it addresses every single issue. It addresses the key roots that feed into things like poverty, violent crime, separation, isolation, alienation. All of these are very well documented in many research papers about how equality actually reduces all of those ills in society, even when it comes to our health. So to say that we need an equal kind of equalizing force, to say that we need some kind of new system that is based on supporting that life and supporting a basic income as a starting point, is not to say that this is an economic system that we're supporting. No, it's a value of life that we're supporting, and I think that is a very empowering solution.
Joanna, I'd like to also have your perspective on how we usually profile to these kids. You know, we've seen with Jared Loughner or Lanza as well, and other shooters that we only later get to know that they were on medications, especially SSRIs, and we don't get to know more of them, but mostly in the media they tend to be portrayed as some kind of monsters, or, you know, people that just went crazy and listened to this or that type of music, as it happened with the Columbine shooters as well. So what are we not seeing also in the media to create a form of social awareness of, hey, these are human beings, these are ourselves as well? What are we not doing to them that is causing them to become who they became?
Yeah. Yeah, sure, Marlen. And just to add on what Joe was mentioning regarding bringing that economic system forward, it's actually establishing our priorities, because that's what is missing thus far. So placing life and what we need to live well and consider everyone's needs, then it will definitely align so many other aspects of our society that are completely misaligned because of that survival system that we've been living on. In regards to the actual children and, well, children or teenagers, that is like the profile varies, but what I've been, and also based on this book that I read not so far ago, which was The People of the Lie, where it's actually an analysis of what children reflect, and that they don't need to be that young, but actually they reflect the parents. And so if we bring that to ourselves, then it's our responsibility as adults in our society to take care of whatever is manifesting in the children. And there are so many kind of elements that we could already point towards in terms of like symptoms, and that we see that some kids may show, and we don't give the necessary attention, and then it's easier to then just blame or just say yes, this is, and then create those profiles to justify this is a type of music they will behave like this, when in fact it's actually what is causing them to perhaps feel that anger within themselves, or to feel sometimes also excluded from society, and they just need attention or affect. And well, in these situations they do receive the attention, because then the news go all over, like go crazy, and they show pictures of them everywhere, and so it actually feeds something that is missing within them. And we haven't yet found a way to actually address those issues that they are going through. Does that make sense? Could you hear me?
Yes, we could hear you, and I agree that there is, if we look at how to prevent terrorism, how to prevent this kind of domestic terrorism or any other form of lone wolves that go out and shoot people, is looking at, well, where were their parents? Maybe they were working over 12 hours a day and they never saw them, they never actually communicated with them. Maybe they were bullied in school. Well, what is causing bullying in school? What is in our culture, in our society, that is promoting that? Also, you know, some people point out that, well, video games are the problem, there's too much violence. But if there was support to a person, then they would know that that is a video game, that that is fiction, that that is just a form of entertainment, that sure, we would have to regulate in one way or another to not make it a constant in people's mindset, but to know how to deal with that, to know how to deal with their emotions and generally with the world. And as Joe was mentioning, what do you expect in a world where you're sometimes also profiled for the personality that you have, the race, the religion? And considering on this, we have a question from Anton, who is asking, I find it puzzling a young Muslim couple with a 6-month-old baby would do such an act. It smells very much like a story that will serve a preset narrative. What's your take on it? Thanks. So, Joe.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question, Anton, because this is very illustrative of a lot of what happens in the media coverage, especially around agendas. What I mean by that is we now have this society where we will be exposed to a news story and we'll go into an emotional reaction about it, and then a narrative is told to us that explains to us, you know, why did this happen, who did this, so that we can get our sense of justice, so that we can get our sense of closure because of how we've been inflicted by what we saw. And in the case of the San Bernardino shooting, evidence is coming out allegedly that this is being done by, well, among the perpetrators was a young couple, a young Muslim couple who had a young child. And this is very interesting because this doesn't fit the American narrative of the extremist Muslim. So we now have this very interesting rebranding of what homespun terrorism could look like. Home-baked terrorism is now in the form of any Joe American. You could be a young couple, and especially if you're Muslim, you could still be seen as terrorist. So now we have this sense of, well, we can't trust anybody. You know, we need more police presence. We need more security. We need more control from the government in terms of tighter security around guns, around everything. And we are more prone to give up our liberties. We're more prone to give up our sense of personal responsibility and awareness in exchange for that security. So, Anton, the way that you framed that question is excellent, because to me, this strikes me as absolutely a preset narrative. You know, the story of here's this young Muslim couple that has gone on this shooting rampage, killing all these people. How terrible. Well, what's the solution? Well, we're going to need to look at terrorism not just out there, but here in the domestic United States. And on this point, for those who are interested, there is a lot of information regarding the use of terror drills. To bring this point in here very quickly, just before the shooting happened, the SWAT teams in San Bernardino County were actively practicing for the scenario of an active shooter at a college that was just a few miles away. What are the odds that the exact scenario that the police enforcement was practicing for would happen just days after the training scenario? I mean, that's astronomical odds, and one would be foolish to not look at that and you know, investigate and ask, hey, you know, is there something going on here? Is it really just coincidence? So to answer your question, from my perspective, Anton, yes, absolutely, preset narratives are in play.
And it's becoming like a terrorist cliche, I'd say. And, you know, I even said it when we were discussing that the news was upcoming. I said, well, you know, we're just waiting to hear that someone was shouting Allahu Akbar, and the passport from a Syrian rebel or a Syrian person or a Muslim was found in the scene. You know, the usual cues that we are already aware of on how they identify the terrorists and the people, the shooters, and so forth. And yeah, definitely the point of discussing these kind of topics is precisely to question further. If you still believe that everything that the government says is true or that the media says is true, it's time to question that. Because the way that the world is currently shaped, not only with the wars, but also with these home-baked terrorism stories, are actually the way that they keep our minds entrained in a particular direction that is not necessarily looking at, well, what caused the whole thing? How have we as a society become also paranoid now about everyone, because people, what we'll do, and it's already happening with Islamophobia and just hatred toward Muslims, it will create further separation, and we will disregard the fact that we're human beings, and instead of going to them and saying, hey, what is going on with you? Can I help you? You know, to really get to know each other, we're more like becoming afraid of each other, and this is perfect for control. The more scared people are, the more controls can be implemented, and no one will question it because, hey, it's for your security. And so the media becomes just this constant thing that you can get entrained by constantly listening to it, by the Twitter feeds and so forth. And the moment that you react to it, you become part of a terrorist as well, because then you will accept whatever comes out of it and not question it and just be perpetrated by that fear, which is precisely what we suggest to not do, to rather take things for what they are and start doing further research, because then you might find, hey, yeah, why would the government or specific groups create this kind of terrorism? What is the agenda behind it? So what have we ultimately missed in all of this? Joanna, would you like to add to this? Is she listening?
Sorry,
Okay.
Marlen, I'm just having some technical issues. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. You know, in regards to that, the pre-narratives that may exist, from what I notice is that there's also some kind of formula that seems to work. There's a formula whenever there's a news that people can explain, they can talk about it, they can kind of affect their emotions so badly that it will transcend any other news that might happen that might be as important or as relevant for society. In 10, I believe, there was a big manifestation here in London, actually, back in London. And there was other things happening during that time. However, they
We are not hearing Joanna, so you can't either, right, Joe?
No.
Okay, so can you jump in, Joe, then?
Sure.
There
Well,
was
Joanna, we aren't
Sorry.
hearing you, so if you want to repeat.
Okay.
From the last point that you were sharing, if you heard when I said that we weren't hearing you. Okay, so it seems she cannot hear us, so let's jump to Joe.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure which thread Joanna was going into, so I'll bring in a different dimension for now, and we can come back to that later. One thing I wanted to bring into this was the importance of understanding the spinning of narrative when we're presented with these things in the news. And I say this because when you look at the whole picture, and when you do some research, for example, when you look at the pattern of these active shooter events, or many other major events such as terrorist attacks, what you find is the same pattern of the local law enforcement will be running drills specifically for that exact same scenario that happens. And oftentimes what you find happening is the drill becomes live, meaning just in the case of the San Bernardino incident, the reason why the SWAT team was able to mobilize itself so quickly, so efficiently, was because they were already running a drill for the exact same scenario just a few miles away. And so, and literally, there was a report that came out in the local news where the department said, well, we were already in gear and ready to roll. That was a direct quote. So this is telling you exactly that these incidents are followed by a premeditated plan a lot of the time. It may not be the case that every single event was planned out by some conspiratorial elite, but it does go to show you that there is much more that happens that we are not told in the media. A second thing to keep in mind when we're looking at active shooters and their representation in the media is the role that SSRI plays. SSRI is a kind of as a category of drugs. These are antidepressants, and when you look at the history of active shooter incidents, especially in America, pretty much 90% of the shooters were on some form of the antidepressant. Now, I'm not here to say that the antidepressants caused the violent outbreak, but when you understand what these drugs do to a person, when a person's already predisposed to depression and thoughts of harm, and they're already living in a society that looks down on mental illness instead of looking at what causes mental illness holistically, you find that these are individuals that are taking these medications from a pharmaceutical complex that looks at them as money, as profit generators. There is no interest in curing these people or looking holistically. You're looking at individuals that are coping and suppressing what is causing them the ill with these drugs. And oftentimes what happens with this suppression is that the violent tendencies tend to manifest and burst out. So again, this is not to say that the SSRI classification of drugs is what's causing the shootings. No, but these drugs are an active part because it makes worse what's already there in the pain of these individuals. So that's something to also take into account when we look at the story of, oh, these are just lone nuts, or these are extremists, or these are just, he's a crazy guy who lived on his own and that's why he was all messed up. And the narrative of the lone nut, it just doesn't apply when we look holistically at what causes mental pain and separation in society and how much worse that becomes when compared when combined with these classifications of antidepressant drugs.
A real responsibility is to precisely not take immediately the solutions that may come from top down, from the powers that be, a president and so forth, but precisely to get informed into what was behind the mindset of these individuals, what happened in their lives, so that we also take that collective responsibility to share with each other. I mean, this will be a news or a topic that will come up in discussions with your family and your friends, to precisely push all of us together to open up further these points. Like, hey, you know, I heard this perspective on it being a planted terrorist point in order to advance certain agendas. Let's find about it. Or why don't we ask what was wrong with these people's lives that pushed them to do such a thing? What are we not doing in our society that is enabling them sufficient support and to provide, in essence, an environment that promotes solidarity and real sense of loving thy neighbor as thyself? That is really not happening anywhere in the world, and that is the source of any hatred that leads to this kind of shooting. So if the powers that be, as also Kelly Posey, who couldn't be here today, was saying, if they would use this justification to present a desired solution, we can turn it around to create real solutions, to provide further perspectives and more in-depth perspectives, like how about not only health programs in terms of mental health and prevention of this kind of escalation in terms of depression and so forth, but also questioning the big pharma, as you were mentioning, Joe. I think it's very relevant. Parenting, because really a person is not born a terrorist, for God's sake. It has to be a process of creation, and we're all into it because we're all part of our society, and that's really the responsibility that we hold to each other. If we want to stop any person, for that matter, to resort into this kind of things, to kill another, which, you know, in a sense, we are all equal, we are all humans, we are all living beings, so killing each other, killing another yourself to present the message, it's really just a far cry for help, for, hey, we need to do something to sort out bigger problems that won't just be solved by controlling guns or not. Joanna, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. I'm sorry, I can't have my video on. My internet is just not there yet.
Fine.
But yeah, I could hear you, and it's an excellent point, Marlen. And it's, as you said, it's a cry for help, and people, they are willing to receive that help if that help comes first. If there's no help around, and if that's not actually creating an environment that is supportive for human beings, no matter what their age are, what their problems are, that actually they're welcoming, and it's like, okay, that's the problem, we're going to find a solution, we're going to prevent things from getting worse. And you know, on that book that I was mentioning earlier, The People of the Lie, actually, there's a story of this kid who is given a gun by his parents. He's actually American, so it's a kind of a symbolic gift. You're now mature enough, here's your gun. And then he killed himself. And then the youngest child, so his brother, was caught stealing a car. I think it was something like that. And that was actually his first cry for help. He was stealing, and his next step would be to also commit suicide, because eventually his parents offered him a gun as well. So they didn't actually consider that the fact of giving him the weapon of the crime in a certain vulnerable situation where kids sometimes exist in, it's actually just feeding the whole idea that's here's the only solution for you. And obviously we know that killing yourself or killing other people, it's not a solution for anything, and therefore we need to be attentive to those symptoms that our society is showing us. Things are not okay. Where can we put solutions in place to prevent further consequences? And in regards to the label of terrorism, I think that is actually a way of not taking responsibility as a label that it's really easy to place on people, instead of actually looking, well, how was your education? What was lacking? How is your health situation? And making sure that it's more of a holistic view, instead of just pushing, or isn't the same with people putting people in prisons, like in jails. It's just a way of putting like garbage aside and then don't look into it, but it's still here. We're still responsible for it. So and that's the kind of mentality that we have to consider more of like a long-term view instead of just looking at the immediate results. And that's, unfortunately, that's what the media is looking for. They want for immediate results so that they have content, so they can sell more newspapers, have more advertisements around their shows, and that creates a system that is already there, but it is us who can now kind of say, hey, wait a second, let's actually try to know what was this person's state of mind, and how can we prevent further situations, because otherwise it's just going to keep on repeating and it's the same cycle all over again, unfortunately.
Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. When we look at any kind of societal ill, whether it's violent crime, rape, theft, it all boils down to one common root, which is, as we've stated before in several hangouts now, it's our relationship to survival. And the way things are set up now in the world is that your survival must be purchased through money. And our money system operates in a way that is parasitical. For more context on that, you guys are more than welcome to check out our other videos and look for the resources that we provide on this issue. But ultimately, when we're looking at the total solution, there is this tendency to want to look at all of the symptoms by themselves and address each symptom separately, when really these symptoms have the common root of the way that we're living is not in any way making sense, because we're living under the rules of a system that is completely made up to begin with and is based on rules that take away the value of life. So when we address that, and when we address that principle of changing who we are, what we live for, and how we live, and how we decide to value the life that we have and exchange that value amongst each other, we're kind of, it's kind of like missing the actual problem, right? It's you're treating the symptoms without understanding the true nature of the disease. So again, when we talk about the solutions as a living income, it's important to understand the why of it, and not just the numbers and the economics. They are relevant, but I think the principle is what should come forward, is that we can no longer accept a world where we place our survival ahead of the fact that we're already here. We don't need to buy something that we are born into. And we can recreate life in a totally different way by changing the way that we value our existence, our time, and our labor.
If anything, we should really take this kind of attention that is given to these events and really push to continue sharing precisely these kind of principles that you've shared, Joe and Joanna, in terms of looking further into the subject and to say, look, this wouldn't happen if we were genuinely living in a world that is genuinely good for everyone, and everyone is having a life that they can live to their utmost potential, and they suffer no violence, no abuse, and they don't suffer poverty. These things would certainly change the way that we live now, and I'm sure that the tag of Muslim or any other form of personality trait that people tend to tag people with would become absolutely irrelevant, because then we would genuinely get to know what it means to work together to create a better world. But the more that we are divided, the more that we give into fear, the less likely that is going to happen. So it is our duty to precisely push beyond the narrative that is shared by the media and to push for that common sense, for that principled understanding of, if we all give to each other a better living, if I stop hating, if I stop judging, if I stop, you know, we all have those kind of traits that accumulate in one person to become a terrorist. If we stop that within ourselves to another and instead think of solutions and think of way to move forward, then we will stop also our inner terrorist and our continuous fight against the world and reality, because that is ultimately what we're witnessing. And yes, it happens because we are not creating, and we have not created a system that is working for everyone, but it doesn't mean that we cannot and that now we just have to wait for president to give us a solution. We have to create it, and that's the whole point of these hangouts. So I'd like us to wrap up this hangout. Any last words from both of you guys, if you have any? Go, Joanna.
Yeah, I would like to just say something quickly, Marlen. I hope you can hear me. You know, I see this as having different layers, it's especially in the news, for example. Can you hear me? Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Go ahead.
can.
We can hear you.
Okay, we have a question from Anton just in, so in the meantime, as we get Joanna back, to add from Anton, the Islamic fanatic views perfectly play into the hands of the elite agenda. They are like perfect bedfellows, so can't dismiss Islamic fanatism, equally can't dismiss how that assists the big agenda. What's your take? I say education and awareness. What's your take, Joe? I would simply say that when you and you know, I've seen many people also pointing out, and also in our previous hangout on the Paris attacks, how we were kind of dismissing the fact that there is this extremist aspect to Muslims and Islam. But when we give into that sort of rhetoric, we are missing out precisely everything that we've discussed as well, in terms of, well, what happened in their lives and in their own education, even if it's religious indoctrination, that allows such kind of attack and abuse to be part of their mindset, to be part of their lives, to even hold such an idea in their minds to perpetrate these kind of events. So, Joe, any perspective?
This is one of those multi-dimensional topics, obviously. To lend my perspective on the issue of Islamic fanaticism, it is not to say that there is not Islamic fanaticism. That is a part of the situation of the world right now, but we have to look at what's behind that, meaning who benefits the most out of Islamic fanaticism? Is it the Islamists? Or is it those who benefit from being able to use them as pawns, as blunt instruments for foreign policy? Now, this goes into a much deeper subject of international politics and history and things like that that we can't cover quite well here. But to address your comment, Anton, we cannot dismiss Islamic fanaticism, but we do need to understand where it comes from, what engenders the fanaticism part of that, which I say comes from a society that has had to deal with a lot of internal inequalities that need to be addressed, yes, but also they have not been given support from the international community. They have been turned into, rather, tools for foreign policy. They have been, in a way, directed and supported to become more and more extremist. They've been funded and literally armed by governments that have an interest in using them specifically for the purpose of destabilizing regions. This is all a classic play out of the CIA's own playbook. You can find all of this in their own documents. So in terms of the Islamic extremism, yes, it's an issue, but let us not forget that this extremism comes out of a set of conditions. And this set of conditions is that the people are not given access to actual education or the opportunity to explore and live their lives and educate themselves and become functioning members of the global society. Rather, they turn to the extremism because that's the way that they can, A, escape from this reality in the hopes of the glory of jihad, or find community within the camaraderie. Yes, it's extremism. Yes, it's violent and antithetical to humanity, but that is the only kind of camaraderie that's left to them. So we can't really blame them for that. Rather, let's understand the core concepts of what drives that fanaticism and address that by providing a solution such as what we provide as the Equal Life Foundation.
I agree on that, and to also never give into the narratives that only tend to blame one faction or the other, or one ideology or whichever. Always look further and always get down to the point of, we're human beings. We must know better than these. So why are still we falling into these kind of narratives which only divide and conquer, which is the whole point in any case for this kind of events, isn't it? So Joanna, you wanted to share some final point on the journalistic responsibility. So can you share with us?
Yeah, absolutely, Marlen. So, I mean, this is just an example of how we should also demand for a better journalistic approach in current mainstream media, and the responsibility that each person that is typing certain words or they're saying certain words and broadcasting, they should be also taken into consideration. And us, as the audience, being responsible for what we hear and what we accept and then what we say to our peers, for example. And this is there's like some perspectives that even journalists should have licenses. So if they are saying certain things that are lies, or they are completely against a specific group, then they should also be accountable for creating ideas in people's heads that may lead into really dramatic consequences. The same with the film industry, and also finally on that point, it's well, obviously we talk about the education, but in essence is bringing these situations onto ourselves and to be our own journalists, if we say that, and that see how we process information. My final comment actually was what I was trying to say earlier on, was that we see very different layers in society. So even in very rich countries, if we look at Finland or Sweden, there are high taxes of, for instance, suicide. However, it is actually part of journalistic responsibility to not make such a big news about it, because it is shown that when those news are actually very promoted, it may lead so that that rate increases. So people are aware of the influence that news may have in people's actions, and therefore only those news channels are actually interested in creating more violent scenes. They will be the ones also showing certain violent scenes, because they know this will have kind of an influence and audience. So this is the kind of responsibility that we think we should demand, and also be the ones preventing that to affect us.
Yeah, that is a great point, and ultimately, precisely as Anton is also saying, to be our own journalists, to not fall into the trap of fear-mongering and terror and paranoia. That is precisely what the shock doctrine is all about. I also recommend, if you want to know more about the Islam and the whole thing, Gladio B series with James Corbett and Sibel Edmonds. It's very recommendable to understand that. We wouldn't have any time for that in this hangout. So, Joe, any last points?
Just to sum up what we've covered today, which has been a very broad topic, always consider yourself to be ultimately responsible for any information that comes your way. Never ever take anything at face value. When we are presented with news stories like these shooter events, or any news stories that garner this kind of sensationalized attention, always remember that you have the responsibility to keep the journalists in check. You have the responsibility to fact check what's given to you, what's presented to you, not the journalists. That might be their job, but it's your responsibility to make sure that you're not participating in and simply going along with the narratives, because this is how agendas are formed. This is how consent is created without your awareness. Now, as long as we allow that to continue, we'll always be slaves to our own ignorance, and we have the power to stop that. So I encourage everybody to strive for their own sense of journalistic integrity. Whenever we're presented with anything, always seek alternative sources, cross-reference, find sources that'll tell you the bigger picture, find the links that are not given to you in mainstream media, and give yourself the gift of that kind of expanded worldview. so that you become an even more effective participant in the world that we're creating together.
Fully agree on those words. So this is the wrap for this hangout. Thanks to everyone for watching. If you have further comments, if you didn't make it into the live broadcast, please share them on the YouTube video as well. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Joe. And see you guys some other time. Hopefully not with another terrorist point, but we will be here also to expand awareness on many other topics that we surely can take further responsibility for. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you next time.